David Collins, a 38-year-old single dad, sat hunched over a thick folder of crumpled papers and unpaid invoices. His 11-year-old daughter Lucy sketched quietly beside him in her worn notebook. But David's exhausted eyes remained fixed on numbers that simply refused to add up. Contracts slipping away like sand through his calloused fingers. One lost deal meant no roof over their heads by Christmas. Then a well-dressed stranger slid into the booth across from him, offering a knowing smile that carried dangerous secrets. Stay with us. This touching story will surprise you with unexpected hope. David Collins had built his small construction company, Collins & Sons, from nothing more than a pickup truck, a toolbox inherited from his father, and the desperate need to provide for his family after losing his wife, Sarah, to cancer 2 years earlier. The irony of the company name wasn't lost on him. There were no sons, just Lucy, who had inherited her mother's artistic talent and her father's stubborn determination to see the good in impossible situations. Tonight, the fluorescent lights of Mel's Diner cast harsh shadows across financial documents that told a story of systematic failure. Larger construction firms had been undercutting his bids at every turn, using connections and resources that a one-man operation could never match. The Riverside Community Center project, his last hope for staying solvent through the winter, was slipping away to Davidson Construction, a corporate giant that could afford to bid below cost just to eliminate smaller competitors. "I can't do this anymore," David muttered under his breath, running his hands through hair that had started showing gray since Sarah's diagnosis. The stack of overdue notices seemed to mock him. Mortgage payment 3 months behind, truck payment overdue, Lucy's school expenses mounting with each passing week. Lucy looked up from her sketch, a drawing of their small house surrounded by flowers that existed only in her imagination, and placed her small hand over his calloused one. "Dad, don't give up," she whispered with the fierce optimism that children possess even when their world is crumbling around them. "Mom always said you could fix anything." That's when the stranger appeared, sliding into the booth across from them with the fluid confidence of someone accustomed to making bold moves in uncertain situations. Michael Grant was everything David wasn't. Expensive suit perfectly tailored, silver hair styled with precision, shoes that probably cost more than David's monthly grocery budget. But his eyes held something unexpected. Genuine interest rather than the casual dismissal that successful men usually showed struggling contractors. "Excuse me," Michael said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of corporate boardrooms. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. You're bidding on the Riverside project?" David's instinct was to close the folder, protect his family's privacy from this well-dressed stranger who had no business knowing about their financial desperation. But something in Michael's expression, not pity but recognition, made him pause. "Yeah," David replied cautiously, "or trying to." "Why?" Michael leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "Because I know the people making those decisions, and I know they're being fed information that's designed to eliminate smaller contractors before the real evaluation even begins." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card, writing something on the back. "Call Patricia Williams at the city planning office tomorrow morning. Ask her about the amended specifications that were released last Friday, the ones that Davidson's people somehow received 3 days early." David stared at the card, suspicious of generosity that seemed too convenient to be genuine. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." Michael's smile carried a weight that spoke of personal experience with failure and second chances. "Let's just say I understand what it feels like to lose everything you've worked for. Sometimes we all need someone to level the playing field." Over the following days, Michael's advice proved invaluable in ways that went far beyond simple insider information. He appeared again at the diner, this time carrying copies of city regulations that David had never seen, explaining bidding procedures that larger firms use to their advantage, and providing contact information for subcontractors who could help reduce costs without sacrificing quality. David followed Michael's guidance with the cautious hope of someone who had been disappointed too many times to trust completely. He called Patricia Williams, who confirmed that amended specifications had indeed been released, specifications that would have disqualified his bid if he hadn't known to request them. He renegotiated supplier contracts using strategies that Michael had outlined, securing better prices on materials that had been eating into his profit margins for months. Small victories began accumulating. A residential renovation project that came through neighborhood referrals, a commercial repair job that led to additional work, enough steady income to bring his truck payment current and reduce the stack of overdue notices that had been haunting his kitchen table. One evening after Lucy had fallen asleep in the diner booth over her homework, David and Michael talked with the honesty that comes when exhaustion strips away social pretenses. David shared his grief over Sarah's death, his overwhelming guilt at feeling like he was failing to provide the stable childhood that Lucy deserved, his fear that every financial setback brought them closer to losing the only home his daughter had ever known. "I worked construction for 20 years before starting my own company," David confessed, staring into his coffee cup as if it might contain answers to questions he'd been afraid to ask. "I thought I understood business, but Sarah was the one who handled the paperwork, the negotiations, the relationship building. Without her, I'm just a guy with tools who doesn't know how to play the corporate game." Michael listened without judgment, then shared his own story with equal vulnerability. "I once lost everything in a single bad deal. My family, my company, my reputation. I thought success was just about being smarter and more ruthless than everyone else. It took losing everything to understand that business is really about trust, and trust is built through helping people rather than using them." Lucy, who had been drawing quietly while the adults talked, looked up from her sketch pad and studied Michael with the direct gaze that children use when they're trying to understand something important. "Are you lonely?" she asked with the brutal honesty that makes adults uncomfortable, but cuts directly to emotional truth. Michael's composure wavered for just a moment. "Yes, sweetheart, I am." "Dad gets lonely too," Lucy said matter-of-factly. "But he's not lonely when you're here." The bond that formed between them transcended the simple business relationship that had brought them together. Michael began helping Lucy with school projects that required research skills David didn't possess, listening to her stories about friends and teachers with the patient attention of someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be needed for something other than professional expertise. David found himself looking forward to their evening meetings at the diner, not just for the business advice, but for the companionship of someone who understood the weight of responsibility that single parents carry. Michael's presence provided something that David hadn't realized he'd been missing: an adult conversation partner who saw him as more than just Lucy's father or a struggling contractor. Lucy began referring to Michael as "our friend" when talking to her classmates, describing him as the person who helped her dad with important grown-up stuff and who always remembered to ask about her art projects and school activities. The three of them developed routines that felt like family traditions. Thursday dinners at the diner where Lucy would show Michael her latest drawings while David reviewed project proposals. Weekend trips to the hardware store where Michael learned about construction supplies while Lucy picked out paint colors for their kitchen renovation. But beneath the growing comfort of their relationship, David sensed that Michael was carrying secrets that went deeper than his vague references to past business failures. The expensive suits, the detailed knowledge of corporate strategies, the way other business people treated him with a mixture of deference and wariness. These details suggested a background more complex than Michael had revealed. But when David learns who Michael really is, the devastating truth will test everything they've built together. The revelation came through a newspaper article that David discovered by accident while waiting in Patricia Williams' office for a permit inspection. The business section featured a retrospective on major corporate scandals of the past decade, and Michael's photograph stared back at him from the front page, not as an unknown helpful stranger, but as the former CEO of Grant Industries, the parent company that now owned Davidson Construction. David's hands trembled as he read the details of Michael's fall from grace: a hostile takeover orchestrated by his former partner, Victor Hale, financial irregularities that had been blamed on Michael's leadership, a bitter legal battle that had stripped him of his position and most of his assets. The man who had been helping David navigate corporate politics was actually the former king of the very system that was trying to destroy small contractors like him. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming and immediate. Everything Michael had done, the advice, the connections, the seemingly genuine friendship, suddenly appeared calculated and manipulative. David drove home in angry silence, his mind racing through every conversation they'd shared, looking for signs of deception he'd been too trusting to notice. When Michael appeared at the diner that evening as usual, David was waiting with the newspaper spread across the table like evidence in a criminal trial. "You want to explain this?" David demanded, his voice tight with hurt and fury. "All this time, you've been playing some kind of game with us. What was the plan? Get close to the small-time contractor so you could use him somehow." Michael's face went pale as he recognized his photograph in the newspaper. "David, please let me explain. It's not what you think." "Really?" David's voice rose, causing other diners to turn and stare. "Because what I think is that a disgraced corporate executive has been using my family to make himself feel better about his own failures. You were just slumming with the working class for entertainment." Lucy, who had been coloring quietly beside her father, looked back and forth between the two men with growing distress. "Dad, why are you yelling at Michael? He helps us. Ostrom." "He was lying to us, sweetheart," David said, his anger softening slightly when he saw his daughter's confusion and hurt. "He's not who we thought he was." But before Michael could respond, Lucy surprised them both by speaking with a wisdom that seemed far beyond her 11 years. "So? You're still my dad even when you're sad about Mom. Michael is still our friend, even if he used to have a different job." The confrontation was interrupted by David's phone ringing with news that would change everything. The Riverside Community Center contract decision was being announced early, and he needed to attend an emergency meeting at City Hall immediately. When David arrived at the municipal building, he found Victor Hale holding court in the conference room, surrounded by city officials and Davidson Construction's legal team. Hale's presence made Michael's past deception even more painful. This was the man who had destroyed Michael's career, and now he was positioning himself to destroy David's as well. "Collins," Hale said with barely concealed contempt, "I'm afraid there's been an irregularity with your bid. Someone has been feeding you insider information, which constitutes a violation of the procurement process. Davidson Construction will be awarded the contract by default." The accusation was designed to eliminate David while destroying any remaining credibility that Michael might possess in the local business community. It was the kind of ruthless corporate maneuvering that had made Hale successful and left his former partner disgraced and unemployed. But then something unexpected happened. Michael entered the conference room, carrying a briefcase full of documents that he placed methodically on the table in front of the city officials. "Mr. Hale," Michael said with quiet authority, "I think these gentlemen should see the real story behind Davidson Construction's bidding practices." For the next hour, Michael systematically exposed the web of corruption that Hale had built around the city's construction contracts, bribed inspectors, falsified material certifications, subcontractors who existed only on paper. The evidence was damning and comprehensive, the kind of detailed documentation that could only have been assembled by someone with intimate knowledge of corporate fraud. "You're destroying yourself for nothing," Hale warned Michael as city officials began making phone calls to law enforcement agencies. "Testifying against me means you'll never work in this industry again. You're throwing away your last chance at redemption." Michael looked through the conference room windows to where David sat in his truck with Lucy, both of them watching the building with expressions of hope and fear. "No," Michael said simply. "I'm finally understanding what redemption actually looks like." The Riverside Community Center contract went to Collins and Sons 3 days later, not because of political connections or corporate manipulation, but because David's bid represented honest value delivered by someone who understood the community's actual needs. The victory felt different from anything David had experienced in his business career. Not just financial survival, but validation that integrity could compete successfully against corruption when the playing field was finally level. Michael's testimony against Victor Hale and Davidson Construction triggered a federal investigation that ultimately sent Hale to prison and dissolved the web of fraudulent companies he had built. But the cost to Michael was exactly what Hale had predicted. He was now effectively blacklisted from the corporate world that had once been his kingdom, unemployable in the industry where he had spent his entire adult life. In the weeks following the contract award, David found himself in the unfamiliar position of having more work than he could handle alone. The Riverside project led to referrals throughout the community, residential jobs that came through word-of-mouth recommendations, commercial clients who had been watching his battle against corporate corruption with interest and approval. "I need help," David admitted to Michael one evening at the diner, spreading project timelines across the table between them. "Good help," someone who understands both the construction side and the business side, who can help me build something that lasts. Michael looked up from the financial projections he'd been reviewing, his expression cautious. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a partnership, David replied. Collins and Grant Construction. We'll specialize in second chances, hiring people who need work, taking on projects that bigger companies won't touch, proving that doing business honestly doesn't mean doing business poorly. The partnership transformed both men in ways neither had anticipated. David learned to navigate the business world with confidence rather than desperation, understanding that his technical skills and ethical standards were actually competitive advantages rather than limitations. Michael discovered that success measured in community impact and employee loyalty felt more meaningful than the quarterly profit reports that had once defined his worth. Lucy thrived in their unconventional family structure, proudly telling her classmates about my dad and Uncle Michael, who were building important things together. She appointed herself as the company's unofficial artist, creating drawings that decorated their small office, and designing a logo that featured tools and blueprints surrounded by houses that looked like homes rather than investments. 6 months after the Riverside contract was completed, the three of them returned to Mel's Diner for what had become their weekly tradition. But instead of financial stress and uncertain futures, their conversation centered on project schedules and hiring decisions, and Lucy's plans for the community garden she wanted to design behind the new community center. We're a real team now, right? Lucy asked, looking back and forth between the two men who had become the stable foundation of her world. Like a family, but with tools and blueprints? Michael, who had spent the past year rebuilding his understanding of what success actually meant, smiled with genuine contentment. If you'll have me as part of your family, sweetheart, but I understand if your dad thinks I bring too much complicated history. David looked around the diner where they had first met, the same vinyl booths, the same fluorescent lighting, the same rain-streaked windows. But everything felt different now, not because their circumstances had improved, but because they had learned to trust each other through crisis rather than just comfort. Family isn't about where you come from or what mistakes you've made, David said, echoing wisdom that Sarah had taught him during their marriage. It's about who chooses to stay when things get difficult, who shows up when you need help, who believes in building something better together. The evening ended the way their best evenings always did, with Lucy showing Michael her latest artwork while David reviewed project proposals, with comfortable conversation that didn't need to fill every silence, with the quiet satisfaction of people who had found something worth protecting and nurturing. Outside, the rain continued falling against the diner windows, but inside their booth, three people who had started as strangers had created something rare and valuable. A chosen family built on trust, forgiveness, and the revolutionary idea that second chances could become first priorities when people had the courage to offer them freely. Their story had begun with desperation and deception, but it ended with the kind of love that doesn't require perfection, only presence, honesty, and the willingness to keep showing up for each other when the world gets complicated and hope seems impossible to maintain. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to Our Heart Stories for more powerful tales of family, hope, and the beautiful second chances that await when we choose trust over fear.